Hey there everybody, welcome to Loco Profiling episode 19, DRG 5307. Yeah, that was a very quick intro to the Locomotive, wasn't it? Well, the thing is, I don't have much time to actually do an intro for this. All I'm going to say is that this is going to be another Loco Profiling episode where most of the footage is done not through photographs of the real thing, but rather a few screenshots and some footage that I filmed in GMod. Yes, it's time to actually put that GMod special intro to use. In fact, it's already been a little bit updated, so the version that I uploaded onto YouTube, it's already outdated before I could even use it. Imagine that. So, let's just get right to it. I added a couple of green screen memes to it. Sit back, enjoy, and also enjoy the brain rot that's about to follow for the next 30 seconds or so. This is going to be a bit of a monster to record because I got 3 pages, so let's just get right to it. Introduced in 1939, the Baureihe 50 was the last official addition to the Einheits program, the standardization program of Germany's nationalized railroad company, the Deutsche Reichsbahngesellschaft, or DRG for short, though by this point in time they have shortened the name to just Deutsche Reichsbahn, or DRB. The Einheits program came about in the early to mid-1920s as a project led by mechanical engineer Richard Paul Wagner to give the DRG new standardized steam locomotives that could be used across the entire nationalized network. So if anything, it was indeed a big precursor to what the United Kingdom endured with British Railways in the late 40s and the early 50s. The Baureihe 50 was a lightweight but rugged 210 decapod, predominantly designed for freight trains on secondary routes, and in all, a grand total of 3,164 of them were built between 1939 and 48, making them the most numerous of all official Einheits locomotives. And it seemed that they were the perfect candidate for things beyond the DRG's scope. The tractive effort related geometry will first be given in metric units before being converted into imperial, with the boiler pressure and driving wheel diameter being rounded off to 1 decimal and 2 decimals for the cylinders. But anyway, the tractive effort on the 50s was as followed: 16 bar of boiler pressure, or 232.1 psi, a pair of 600 by 660 millimeter cylinders, or 23.62 by 25.98 inches, and 1400 millimeter driving wheels, or 55.1 inches. This resulted in 51,897 pounds of tractive effort, and when that was combined with a modest axle loading of either 15 or 16 metric tons, depending on the fittings on individual locomotives, and a top speed of 80 kilometers an hour, or 15 miles per hour in either direction, they were ideal for mass production to aid Germany in this little neighbor skirmish known as the Second World War.
Bollocks.
Yes, it's thanks to the war that so many 50s were built, with the design being gradually simplified over the course of the production run, reaching its climax of sorts in 1942 with the creation of their simplified cousins, the full-on Kriegslocomotives of the Baureihe 52. Life for the 50s depends on which half of Germany we're talking about, because for a quick train-unrelated history lesson, Germany was split in half after the Second World War thanks to a demilitarized border in the middle of the country, along the lines of the 4 Allied occupation zones. To give a rough time frame, between 1945 and 49, the United States, United Kingdom, and France had shared control over the western half, and the Soviet Union had complete control over the eastern half. laying the groundwork for a divided Germany, where there was a democratic government in the west and a communist government in the east, with Germany's capital city, Berlin, being divided among those same lines, despite being entirely located deep in the eastern half of the country, leaving West Berlin as this tiny sliver of democracy in what became known as the Eastern Bloc of satellite states for the Soviet Union. And yes, the whole shtick of a country being divided in two halves with different political ideologies also happened in Vietnam and Korea, albeit those countries being divided with democracy in the south and communism in the north. Gradually going back to trains, each half of Germany also had its own railroad now. In East Germany they kept the previous name, the Deutsche Reichsbahn, now abbreviated to DR, whereas in West Germany they rebranded to make a different railroad, the Deutsche Bundesbahn, or DB. Translated into English, we got the German State Railway in the east and the German Federal Railway in the west. Finally, back to the Baureihe 50, there were no fewer than 2,159 of these engines inherited by the Bundesbahn, whereas the Reichsbahn had to make do with a mere 350 of them, because other locomotives of the class ended up in different countries. However, both railroads did run into a worrying problem, with each coming up with a different solution. More on that in a little bit, as we haven't talked about the particular 50 locomotive that serves as our subject yet. So, our specific subject, Locomotive 5307, was built in 1940, but despite being of German design, obviously, it was actually built in Austria, at the Florisdorf Locomotive Works in Austria's capital city, Vienna, and remarkably little of its actual revenue career is known, beyond being retired from service with the Reichsbahn no later than 1993, after spending some time as a stationary boiler. The main event of its revenue career happened in the late 1950s, when the Reichsbahn gave the locomotive the fix for that problem that I haven't discussed yet. The problem was ST-47K, a particular type of steel that was used for making boilers on a lot of Einheits locomotives. And it was an absolute dog shit material, because despite being lighter than normal steel, it aged like milk, far more prone to developing tiny cracks, even resulting in at least a few boiler explosions. These boilers needed to come off, and both the DB and DR went to work on rebuilding policies, with each developing different models of new, more substantial boilers with combustion chambers to try and make the engines a bit safer and even more efficient in fuel and water consumption. On the Reichsbahn in East Germany, this was known as the Reconstruction Program, and 208 locomotives of the Baureihe 50 got this treatment between 1957 and 62 at the maintenance shops in Stendal. The reconstructed engines were redesignated as the Baureihe 5035, being renumbered 503501 through 3708, and 5307 got this treatment in 1958, becoming locomotive 503564. Following the rebuild, the shape of the locomotive differed quite a bit. Skirts on the front covering the cylinders were now standard. The new boiler was a little bit tapered in its shape, so it was also a little bit bigger in diameter at the firebox end compared to the smokebox end. And then of course there was a big trapezium-shaped preheater box, known in German as the Mischvorwärme, in front of the smokestack. It was in this new form that the locomotive spent most of its time on the Deutsche Reichsbahn, and after being withdrawn in 1993, it was bought by a preservation society in the Netherlands, the Veluwse Stoomtreinmaatschappij, or VSM for short, which operates out of an old station and engine facility in the village of Beekbergen. They operate steam-powered passenger trains in tourist service on a former NS line between the cities of Apeldoorn and Dieren, a route that's nearly 22 kilometers long, with stops in the villages of Beekbergen, Loenen, and Eerbeek. And when they were looking for new steam locomotives in the early 90s, the fall of the Berlin Wall and Germany on its way to being reunified allowed enthusiasts and preservationists to buy second-hand engines in decent shape from whatever was left of the Reichsbahn. The 5307, again now 503564, came to the VSM in July of 1993, after it was retired that same month. It then operated for several years, even making a few mainline outings, surprisingly. But a tiny conundrum would arise. The locomotive's number was actually a little bit confusing, as the VSM had two reconstructed 50s in use. In addition to the current 503564, they also had the very similarly numbered 503654. But the process of having one of those locomotives renumbered back to its original identity, well, that wasn't as straightforward as you might think, because the VSM volunteers only really wanted to do that if it went hand in hand with a partial rebuild to better resemble the original design. In the end, the 3564 was chosen for rebuilding and renumbering back to its old identity, 50307, a process that began in the early 2010s. Although the new boiler from the reconstruction program was kept due to being in better shape and obviously newer, the Einheitslook was still strongly replicated thanks to the trapezium-shaped preheater being replaced with an old drum preheater that was standard on Einheits locomotives. And then of course there were the bigger Wagner smoke deflectors, which actually look a little bit like elephant ears. Funnily enough, despite Richard Paul Wagner being the man who came up with the Einheits program as I mentioned earlier, these days his name is only really remembered for these bigger smoke deflectors. But anyway, the newly reborn 5307 is actually the only German steam locomotive preserved in the Netherlands with this type of deflectors, as all other German steam engines in the Netherlands either have no deflectors whatsoever or the smaller smoke deflectors designed by Friedrich Witte. People were content with the engine remaining on the VSM's line between Apeldoorn and Dieren, as that top speed of 50 miles per hour would prohibit the locomotive from mainline running today, with regular trains getting faster and faster with less time between them. So imagine the shock when both of the VSM's operational 50s went mainline in the summer and early fall of 2024. One of the mainline outings for the 5307 was in the first full weekend of October, to participate in the annual steam train days of the SSN, the Stoomstichting Nederland, in Rotterdam, operating regularly timetabled trains between the SSN's depot in Rotterdam and the main train station in Gouda. I'm gonna be honest, seeing an operational 50 there felt surreal.
Slightly unbelievable. A 50 on the main line.
FYI, the 3654 began life as 503154, so it would have been a much more simplistic looking engine back then, being one of the many simplified Übergangskriegslokomotiven. Transitional war locomotives for those in English. So compared to a proper Einheits 50, they look much simpler, as if they were like 70% on their way to becoming a 52. Also, a little bit of extra information. This weekend, so Saturday, December 14th, and today, Sunday, December 15th, the 5307 was out on the main line again. It teamed up with one of the DB Class 23 locomotives that the VSM has, that being the 23076, for some special ferry runs between the cities of Nijmegen and Arnhem, because apparently there was also a big Christmas market in Arnhem this weekend. Unfortunately, the 50 could only operate on the Saturday because later that day it actually had a small mechanical failure regarding one of the bearings from what I've read. So some of the VSM's mainline certified diesel locomotives had to be called in as substitutes. Maybe just goes to show that as cool as it has to have a 50 on the mainline, perhaps it wasn't that great of an idea. Just saying, because again, relatively low top speed, relatively small driving wheels, that means more rotations per minute, if you want to run at a higher speed, and that could increase wear and tear on the bearings and so forth, and other mechanical components. But with that, episode 19 is done and dusted, and for episode 20, which will be my last video of the year, yeah, I got another GMod special. And all I can say about that is that it will be ready for Christmas, hopefully. I'm gonna make sure that it will be ready by Christmas and that I can upload it on December 25th. So, fingers crossed. And when it comes to the engine in question, all I can say is it's big. Perhaps too big. See you then.